On the edge of the Vharun reach, where the old trade lanes frayed into empty dark and the stars thinned like a threadbare cloak, there was a moon called Seshtalun that no one important had ever bothered to remember. It had no seat in any assembly. It sent no envoys to the great ringed capitals of the coalition. It appeared on the star charts only as a small amber dot with a number beside it, and the number was longer than the name, which told you everything about how the wider galaxy regarded the place. To the people who lived there, of course, Seshtalun was the whole of the world. They were the Thessa, a tall and soft-voiced folk with skin the color of river clay and eyes that held their own faint light, so that a Thessa child moving through a dark room seemed to trail two small lanterns behind her. They were a patient species, slow to anger and slower to forget, and they had settled this dry amber moon 3 generations back when the mining consortiums promised prosperity, and then, as consortiums do, took what they wanted and left the rest behind like a shell. What remained was a scattering of low stone towns strung along a single valley, a handful of wells that still gave water, and a great deal of pride that had nowhere in particular to go. The town at the heart of the valley was called Andu-Vesh, which in the old Thessa tongue meant something close to the last kept lamp. It had a square of packed red earth, a covered market that traded more in gossip than in goods, a shrine to ancestors whose names had grown too worn to read, and one long road that came in from the northern flats and went out again toward nothing. Down that road, on a morning when the twin suns were still low and the dust hung gold in the slanted light, a stranger came walking. He came on foot, which was the first strange thing, because no one of any means walked into Andu-Vesh. He led a single pack animal, a gaunt, 6-legged dray mule with a torn ear, and he carried a battered kit bag across his shoulders and a long coat too heavy for the heat. He was young. That was the second strange thing, and the thing that the townsfolk would remember longest afterward, because in their stories the ones who wandered the frontier were always old and bitter men with pasts like closed doors. This one was not. He could not have seen more than 25 of his own world's years. His face was still open, still capable of surprise, and when the children of Andu-Vesh crept to the edge of the square to look at him, he looked back at them and something at the corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile, as if he had not entirely forgotten how. He was a human. None of them had ever seen a human before, though they had heard the word the way one hears the name of a distant weather. Humans came from far Corward, from a busy blue-green world that the Coalition still spoke of with a mixture of respect and unease. There were not many of them out this far. There was, in fact, exactly one, and his name was Elian Marsh, though it would be some days before anyone in Andu-Vesh learned to say it, and longer still before any of them understood why he had come. The truth was that even Elian was not entirely certain why he had come. He had crewed a long-haul freighter for 3 years, and when the freighter's company folded in a distant bankruptcy, he had taken his back pay in the form of the dray mule and a berth on a supply hopper heading rimward, and he had ridden that hopper to the end of its route, and then simply kept going, on foot, through a string of dust towns, because stopping had begun to feel like a thing that would happen to him whether he chose it or not, and he wanted for once to choose it. He had grown up in a crowded arcology stacked 40 families deep, where a person was never alone and never quite together with anyone either, and he had spent his whole young life among a great press of people, and had somehow arrived at the age of 25 without a single soul in the galaxy who would notice if he never wrote again. That was not a thing he said aloud, but he felt it the way you feel a stone in your boot, every step, and he had walked a long way on it. He stopped in the square of Andu-Vesh because the well there was the first he had found in 2 days that still ran clear, and he knelt and drank and let the dray mule drink. And while he did, the whole town watched him from doorways and window slits and said nothing at all. It was the girl who broke the silence. She was small, even for a Thessa child, with the thin arms and enormous luminous eyes of the very young, and she wore a shift dyed the faded blue of a much-loved thing washed too many times. She had detached herself from a knot of older children and crossed the square with the grave, deliberate steps of someone who has decided to be brave and is spending everything she has on it. She stopped an arm's length from the human, folded her hands in front of her the way she had been taught to greet elders, and looked up at him. "You are drinking our water," she said, in the trade Creole that carried across 1,000 worlds, and her small voice did not shake quite. "Are you a thief?" Elian sat back on his heels. Up close the child's eyes were the color of amber lit from within, and there was in them a directness that undid him a little, because children on his own world had learned early to look sideways at strangers, and this one had not. "I hope not," he said. "I asked the well and it didn't say no." He nodded at the stone lip of it. "Where I come from, if the water lets you drink, you're a guest. Is it different here?" The girl considered this with tremendous seriousness. "No," she admitted. "It is the same, but you should still ask a person. The well cannot say no, a person can." "Then I'm asking a person." He inclined his head to her, grave as she was grave. "May I drink your water, and give some to my mule who has been very patient?" She looked at the mule. The mule looked back with its one torn ear drooping, and something in the sorry state of it seemed to decide her. "Yes," she said, "but you must not waste it, and you must tell me your name because I told you mine already." She had not, but she plainly felt she had, in the way that small children feel their intentions are as good as their acts. "I'm Elian," he said, "Elian Marsh, and you didn't tell me yours." She blinked, caught out, and then laughed at herself, a bright startled sound that turned every watching head in the square. "Nyari," she said. "I am Nyari of the house of Sella. My mother is Sella. She weaves the reed cloth, the very best in the valley, everyone says so." A small shadow crossed the light of her face, quick as a bird. "She is the best because she works all the time, because there is only her." Elian did not miss it. He had spent enough of his life among the quietly struggling to know the shape of that sentence, the weight that hung off the end of only her. But he only nodded and did not pry, and that too was a thing the town would remember later, that the human had known when to leave a wound covered. By the time he had watered the mule and refilled his flasks, half of Anduvesh had drifted closer, and an old Thessa man with a staff and a face like cracked leather had come out to stand at the edge of the shrine and study him. This was Toma Veshaldan, the nearest thing the town had to a headman, though he would have laughed at the word. He watched the human be gentle with the animal and grave with the child, and he came to a decision, the way old men on the frontier learned to, quickly and without fuss. "You have come a long way, human," Toma said. It was not a question. "I have," Elian agreed, rising and turning to him and offering the small formal bow he had already borrowed from watching the child. "And I don't want to bring trouble to your door. I can pay for a night's shelter if there's any to be had, and I'll be gone in the morning if that's your wish." Toma looked at him a long moment. Then he looked at the sky to the north, at a smear of ochre haze building along the flats, and his mouth tightened. "There is a storm coming off the pan by evening," the old man said. "The kind that flays a man to the bone and buries the road behind him. No one goes out into that, not even a fool, and you don't have the look of a fool, only of someone who has forgotten he is allowed to stop." He said it plainly, and Elian's throat tightened because it was too near the truth to answer. "You will stay until it passes. We do not turn a guest out into the pan, even a strange one, even a human." A dry flicker crossed his face that might have been humor, especially a human. "My grandfather's grandfather told a story of your kind, and I would like to see whether it was a true story or a lie for frightening children. Come. There is a room over the drying sheds, if you do not mind the smell of reeds." And so Elian Marsh came to stay a night in Anduvesh, and the storm came off the pan just as the old man had said, howling ochre murder against the shutters, and the night became 3 nights, and the 3 nights became a season, in the way that the most important turns of a life are so often taken without anyone quite deciding to take them. The drying shed room was small and clean swept, and it smelled, as promised, of cut reed, a green and honest smell that Elian found he did not mind at all. On the first evening, while the storm screamed and the town huddled behind stone, the girl Nyari brought him a bowl of stew from her mother's pot, carrying it across the yard in the shelter of the eaves, with the exaggerated care of a small person entrusted with a great task. She set it down, and she did not leave. She sat cross-legged on the floor an arm's length away and watched him eat as if it were a performance staged for her benefit. "My mother made this," she informed him. "She said a guest in the storm must be fed, and she said I could bring it because I found you, so you are partly mine." She frowned, working out the logic. "Not to keep. You are a person and you cannot keep a person, but you are my guest. Mine and hers." "That's a great honor," Elian said, and meant it, and the stew was good, thick with root and a spice that warmed the back of his throat. "Will you thank your mother for me, or should I thank her myself?" The shadow again, quick across the amber light. "She is weaving," Nyari said. "She weaves at night when I'm asleep, so that in the day she can pretend she slept. She thinks I do not know." The child picked at the hem of her faded blue shift. "My father went to the deep mine 3 winters ago because a man came and said there was work and coin, and there was a fall, and he did not come back, and neither did the coin. So now there is only her, and there is the debt, because we borrowed against the coin that never came, and the man who lent it comes to the valley every season to be paid." She said all of this in the flat, careful voice of a child reciting a hard thing she has been made to understand too young. "So my mother weaves all night, and she is very tired, and she does not laugh anymore, not the real laugh, only the one she puts on like a coat." Elian set down the bowl. Outside, the storm flung the whole weight of the pan against the shutters and found them stubborn. He looked at the small, solemn creature sitting on his floor, offering him the ledger of her family's grief as though it were the most natural thing in the world to hand a stranger, and he felt something turn over in his chest that he did not have a name for, because no one had ever handed him anything of the kind. In the crowded arcology of his childhood, everyone had kept their griefs locked in their own 40 family stacks, and a boy learned young that no one's trouble was any of his business, and so no one's warmth was either. "I'm sorry about your father," he said, which was inadequate, and he knew it, and he said it anyway because the child deserved to hear it said plainly by someone. "That's a heavy thing to carry. For you and for her." "Yes," Nyari agreed, with the relief of one whose burden has at last been correctly weighed by another. And then, because she was 7 years old and grief and hope lived very close together at that age, she brightened. "Do you know how to fix things? A guest should be useful. The loom shed's roof leaks, and when it rains the reeds get wet, and my mother cannot sell wet cloth, and she cries, though she thinks I do not hear that either." She fixed him with her enormous lantern eyes. "You have big hands. You look like someone who fixes things." Elian Marsh, who had spent 3 years fixing the failing systems of a dying freighter and had never once been thanked for it, looked at the child and looked at the storm, and made the second choice of his own free will that he had made in a very long time. "I do know how to fix things," he said. "Show me the roof in the morning when the storm's done. We'll see what can be done about wet cloth." The storm blew itself out before dawn, the way pandstorms do, leaving the sky scoured to a hard, clean blue, and the whole valley furred with a fine ochre dust that got into everything and made the town sneeze itself awake. Elian was up before the suns cleared the ridge. He had never in his life been able to lie abed once his eyes opened, a habit beaten into him by shift work and never unlearned. And so he was standing in the yard between the drying sheds with a mug of the bitter Thessa root tea, when Nyari came running to fetch him to the loom shed, her bare feet kicking up small puffs of dust, her whole body bright with the importance of her errand. The loom shed belonged to her mother. It stood a little apart from the house, a long, low building of the same red stone as everything else in Anduvesh, and inside it were 3 looms, 2 of them silent and 1 of them strung and half-worked, and the smell of it was the smell of cut reed and lanolin and long, patient labor. And there, at the strung loom, sat Sella. Elian had built, in the space of one evening and the child's careful recitation, a picture of the mother, and the picture had been of someone worn thin and gray with grief. And so he was not prepared for the woman who looked up from the loom. She was not old. She was younger than he had imagined, though there was a tiredness worn into her that had nothing to do with years, a deep-set weariness that lived around her luminous eyes and pulled at the corners of a mouth that must once have smiled easily. Her hands, moving among the reed threads, were quick and sure and beautiful in the way that any hands become beautiful when they truly know their work. She wore her grief the way Nyari had said, like a coat put on each morning, and Elian, who wore a very similar coat, recognized the fit of it at once. "You are the human," Sella said. Her voice was low and careful, a voice that had learned to give nothing away. "My daughter has adopted you, it seems. She informed me this morning that we now have a person who fixes things." A wariness moved behind her eyes. "I have no coin to pay a repairman, human. Whatever she promised you, I cannot pay it. I will not have her make promises this house cannot keep." "She didn't promise me anything," Elian said gently. "And I'm not asking for coin. I'm a guest under the old man's roof until the road's clear, and a guest that sits idle is a guest that goes sour. Where I come from, you earn your bread. Let me look at the roof. If I can fix it, I fix it and we're square and your cloth stays dry. That's all." Sella studied him for a long moment, the way her elder Toma had studied him in the square, the frontier appraisal that weighed a stranger against every stranger who had ever come promising and taken. Whatever she saw, it did not fully unclench her, because the frontier had taught her that a thing given freely usually had a hook in it somewhere. But she was too tired to fight a kindness she could not afford to refuse, and so she inclined her head and went back to her weaving, and let the human climb up onto her leaking roof. The roof was a simple problem, as such things go. The stone was sound, but the reed-end pitch seal along the northern seam had cracked and shrunk in years of sun, and the pitch itself had gone dry and useless. Elian spent the morning stripping the old seal, and the afternoon walking the dry washes below the town, until he found the seep of black bitumen that the Thessa called the ground's blood, and used for 100 things, and he carried it back in his cook pot, and rendered it soft over a low fire, and worked it into the seam with a flat stone and his own 2 hands. And by evening the northern seam of the loom shed was as tight as a drum. He did not stop there. He was a person who, once started, could not easily leave a job half done, and there was a great deal in Onduvesh that had been left half done for want of a spare pair of hands. The well crank had a bent axle that made every draw of water a small daily war. He straightened it. The market awning had a torn spar. He spliced it. A widow 3 doors down had a door that had dropped on its hinges and dragged the floor so that it took 2 people to open it. He rehung it in an afternoon, and the widow wept, and pressed a loaf on him, and he took it because he had learned by then that on Seshdalan refusing a gift was a graver insult than refusing a wound. There was, too, the matter of the children. Onduvesh had a dozen of them, thin and sharp-eyed and old before their time the way frontier children always are, and they had been raised to watch strangers sideways. But Elian did not know how to be watched sideways. He only knew how to be useful and to answer questions, and children, it turns out, are drawn to exactly those 2 things above all others. Within a handful of days they had appointed themselves his crew. They carried his tools and fetched his pitch and squabbled over the honor of holding the mule's lead, and he learned all their names, and he made for the smallest of them, a boy too shy to speak, a little water-wheel toy out of scrap reed that spun in the well runnel, and the boy carried it everywhere for a season and would not be parted from it even in sleep. Elian had never made anything for a child before. He found that the doing of it undid something in him, some long-locked thing, and he made another and another, until half the children of the valley had spinning toys clacking in the runnels, and the sound of them became, that season, the sound of the town being slowly, quietly, happier than it had been. He meant to leave when the road cleared. He said so, plainly, to Toma and to himself. But there is a kind of place and a kind of person for whom the leaving is always tomorrow, and Anduvesh was such a place, and Elian Marsh, though he did not yet know it, was such a person. The road cleared, and there was the matter of the collapsed cistern wall at the upper well, which no one else knew how to shore, and then there was the matter of the harvest of the reed beds, which needed more hands than the town had. And then the twin suns turned in the sky, and it was the cool season, and no one traveled in the cool season. And by the time Elian looked up from the endless small work of the place, a season had gone, and the room over the drying sheds had become, without anyone declaring it so, his. And in all that time, the thing that kept him was not the work he could have found anywhere. What kept him was the child, and the child's mother, and the slow, astonishing discovery that he had somehow, without meaning to, become necessary to two people who had been very alone. It began with the roof, and it grew from there. Nyari attached herself to him with the fierce, wholehearted devotion of a lonely child who has found something worth loving, and she followed him to every job, and handed him tools he did not need, and asked him questions without end. Why did the pitch go soft over the fire and hard in the cold? Why did his kind have only 2 eyes when everyone knew that 3 was better for judging distance? Was it true that on his world the water fell out of the sky whenever it liked, without being drawn, and did people not treasure it, and was that not terribly wasteful? He answered all of it, every question, gravely and completely, because no adult had ever answered his own questions that way when he was small, and he had promised himself, without ever putting it into words, that if he ever met a child who asked, he would answer. And Sela slowly thawed. It was not a sudden thing. She was a woman who had been taught by hard use to expect the hook inside the gift, and she watched Elian for a long time, watched him be kind to her daughter and expect nothing for it, watched him take his meals and mend his own clothes and ask for nothing that she could not give, before she began, by inches, to trust that there was no hook. He took to bringing the day's small news to the loom shed in the evenings while she worked, sitting on an upturned crate near the door, not too near, and telling her what he had mended and who had said what in the market, and she would work and listen, and sometimes, at some foolish thing he reported, the corner of her careful mouth would move. The first time he made her laugh, a real laugh, startled out of her by a story of the widow's door and the loaf, she looked as surprised as if the sound had come from someone else, and she put her hand over her mouth, and there was something in her eyes that was almost fear, the fear of a person who has forgotten she was allowed to feel this and is not sure it is safe. He learned in those evenings by the loom the whole slow shape of her. He learned that she had been the finest young weaver in the valley before her marriage, that her mother and her mother's mother had woven the reed cloth, and that the loom she worked had been her grandmother's, its frame worn smooth by 3 generations of Thessa hands. He learned that her husband had been a laughing, restless man who had never quite believed the valley could hold him, which was why he had gone to the deep mine when the recruiter came with his promises, and that some part of Sela had never forgiven him for going, and never forgiven herself for the not forgiving, and carried both griefs braided together like a cord she could not cut. She told him these things a little at a time, never meaning to, the way a person tells things to someone they have decided, without deciding, to trust. And Elian told her his own, the crowded arcology 40 families deep, the freighter that folded in a distant bankruptcy, the strange truth that a man could spend his whole life pressed against other people and never once be held by any of them. She listened to that with a stillness he did not understand until later, when he realized she had recognized in it the mirror of her own long solitude, 2 people alone in opposite ways, one buried in emptiness and one buried in crowds, arriving somehow at the same cold place and finding, to their astonishment, each other there. Nyari heard the laugh too, from the doorway where she was supposed to be asleep. She said nothing, but that night she crept into Elian's shed with her ragged sleep cloth clutched to her chest, and she stood in the dark until he woke and asked her what was wrong. "You made her do the real laugh," the child whispered. "The one from before, I heard it." Her lantern eyes were very bright in the dark. "Do it again tomorrow, and the day after, please. She is happier when there is a person. I do not want you to go." Elian lay in the dark, a long time after she had padded back to her own bed. He had come to Seshdalan with a stone in his boot, and no soul in the galaxy to notice if he vanished. And now there was a small solemn creature who lay awake in fear of his leaving, and a tired woman who had laughed against her own will at a story he told. And he found that the thought of the road going out toward nothing, the road he had told everyone he would take, had become a thing he could no longer quite look at directly. But the frontier does not leave the struggling long in peace, and the shadow that Nyari had spoken of on the first stormy night was not a thing of the past. It had a name, and the name was Corvin. Elian heard the name first as a change in the weather of the town. The cool season deepened, and as it did a tension crept into Anduvesh, a tightening in the shoulders of the market folk, a hush that fell when the northern road was mentioned. He learned the shape of it in pieces, the way he learned everything, and then one evening Toma Veshalden came to the drying shed with 2 clay cups and a skin of the sharp Thessa spirit that the town kept for weddings and funerals, and sat down heavily on the crate and told him the whole of it. "There is a man who holds the dead of this valley," the old man said. "Vex Corvin, he is not Thessa. He is a broker out of the ring stations, one of the ones who came when the consortium left, and bought up the old company debts for 1/10 of their paper worth, and has been squeezing them at full worth ever since." Toma drank and grimaced and refilled his cup. "When the mine took Sella's husband, and the others with him, this town borrowed to bury its dead and feed the widows through the winter. We borrowed from Corvin because there was no one else. And now the debt breeds faster than we can pay it, and every season he comes to the valley with his hired men, and he takes what payment there is, and he raises the figure, and he reminds us in his soft voice that a debt unpaid may be settled in other coin, in labor, in land, in the taking of a person to the ring stations to work the count off, which is a thing he has done in other valleys and which we have all sworn among ourselves will never be done here." The old man's leathery face was grim. "He comes at the turn of the season. That is soon now. And this season the figure he names will be more than the valley can pay. I have done the reckoning. We cannot make it. And when we cannot make it, he will choose someone to take." Elian sat very still. Outside, a Thessa child was singing somewhere in the dusk, a thin, sweet thread of a song, and it might have been Nyari, and the thought of it put an iron taste in the back of his throat. "Sella," he said, "it was not a question either." Toma looked at him, and his ancient eyes were kind and terrible. "She has the largest single debt in the valley, human, because she buried a husband and borrowed to keep her child fed. And she has a skill that Corvin can sell, the finest hands with reed cloth in the reach, worth good coin on the ring stations. And she has no man of her house to stand for her." He said it plainly, the whole ugly arithmetic of it, and he did not look away. "I tell you this because you have made yourself part of this town, whether you meant to or no. And because I am an old man and I have buried too many, and I would know, before it comes to the worst, whether the human of Anduvesh is a guest who will be gone by the turn of the season, or something else." He set down the cup. "You need not answer me tonight, but answer yourself. Because the girl already has, and I would not have her heart broken twice in one short life." The old man drank the last of the sharp spirit, and rose with the slow care of his years, and left Elian alone in the drying shed with the 2 clay cups, and the whole weight of the arithmetic settling over him like the ochre dust after a storm. For a long while the human did not move. He sat on the upturned crate in the dark with his hands loose between his knees, and he listened to the small sounds of the valley bedding down for the night, the last of the market folk barring their doors, a dray mule shifting in its pen, somewhere the thin sweet thread of a child's song trailing off into sleep, and he understood that every one of those small ordinary sounds was a thing that Corvin could reach into and silence at the turn of a season, and had silenced in other valleys, and would silence here. if no one stood in the way. He got up at last, because sitting had become unbearable, and he went out into the night. The twin moons of Seshtalun were up, one high and one low, and they laid down a double shadow behind him as he walked, so that a man alone was never quite alone on that moon, which was a thing Elian had noticed his first night and had not, until now, understood as a kindness. He walked the length of the single road, past the shrine to the ancestors whose names had worn too smooth to read, past the well where a small solemn creature had once asked him if he was a thief, and he tried, honestly, the way he tried everything, to imagine the northern road. He tried to imagine shouldering his kit at dawn and taking the mule's lead and walking out through the northern flats toward nothing, the way he had told everyone he would, the way he had always, his whole life, eventually done. And he found, standing under the double moons, that he could not make the picture hold. It came apart in his hands like dry pitch. Every time he tried to set his own figure on that road walking away, some part of him turned it around and marched it back, because there was, in the valley behind him, a lit window, and he had spent the whole of his life on the wrong side of every lit window there had ever been, and he was not, it seemed, going to do it again. The lit window was the loom shed. He had not meant to walk toward it, but his feet had, and now he stood in the yard and saw Sella at her grandmother's loom in the lamplight, weaving, as she wove every night, the reed shuttle passing back and forth in her quick, sure hands, and her face in the low light was the face of a woman who has decided that if she only keeps her hands moving the grief cannot catch her, and Elian knew that face because he had worn its human cousin for years. She looked up and saw him in the doorway and did not startle, which told him something, and set down the shuttle, which told him more. "You should be asleep," she said, and there was no reproach in it, only the soft night voice of someone who has also chosen not to be. "So should you," he answered, and came in and sat on the crate by the door where he always sat, not too near. For a while neither of them spoke. The lamp guttered and steadied. Outside, the double shadows shifted as the low moon climbed. And then, because the night was the kind of night that loosens things, Elian said quietly, "Toma told me. About the debt. About the figure this season and what happens when the valley can't make it. About what Corvin came for last time and the time before and who he'll come for this time." He did not look at her when he said the last part. He looked at the worn frame of the loom, 3 generations smooth. "I wanted you to know that I know. So that whatever happens at the turn of the season, you're not standing in it alone thinking no one else can see it." Sella was very still. The shuttle lay where she had set it. When she spoke, her careful voice had gone thin, stripped down to something younger and more frightened than she ever let the daylight see. "There is nothing to be done about it," she said. "I have made my peace, or I have told myself I have, which is not the same thing but is close enough to sleep on some nights. If he takes me, Toma has sworn to keep Nyari, and the valley will feed her, and she will grow up here among people who love her, and that is more than many children get, and I will not weep about it in front of her, not once, so that the last thing she remembers of me is not weeping." Her hands in her lap had knotted themselves together. "So do not be kind to me tonight, human, please. I have built a wall to stand behind, and I need it to hold a while longer, and your kindness is a thing that pulls the stones out one by one, and I cannot afford to have it down when he comes." Elian sat with that a long moment. It was, he understood, the most she had ever given him, and it had cost her, and the honest thing, the only thing, was to give something back of the same weight. "Then I won't be kind," he said. "I'll just tell you a true thing and you can do what you want with it." He turned on the crate to face her. "Where I come from, there were 40 families stacked over my head and 40 under my feet, and I never once in my life had a lit window that was mine to walk toward. I told myself I liked it. I told myself for 25 years that a man with no one is a man who can't be hurt, and I walked out of every place I ever was before anyone could learn my name, because leaving first is the only way to make sure the leaving doesn't happen to you." He drew a breath, and it shook just slightly, and he let it. "And then I came here, and your daughter handed me a bowl of stew in a storm, and I found out I'd been lying to myself the whole time. I wasn't safe. I was just alone. And I don't want to be safe anymore, Sella. I want the window, whatever it costs. That's the true thing. You don't have to do anything with it tonight. But I wanted you to have it so that whatever the wall is holding out, it isn't holding out me. She did not answer him in words. She could not, perhaps. But she picked up the shuttle again, and she did not go back to her weaving. Instead, she held it in both hands and looked at it. And then she looked at him, and something in the set of her shoulders eased by the smallest degree. A single stone left carefully in place instead of pulled. And it was from a woman who had been alone in her grief for 3 winters, very nearly everything. Above them, in the small back room, Nyari slept the boneless sleep of a child who has, for the first time in a long time, no reason to lie awake, and her breathing was soft and even and audible in the quiet, and both of the adults heard it, and both of them understood without saying, so that it was the thing they were each, in their different ways, prepared to spend everything to protect. Elian rose at last and bid her good night, and crossed the dark yard under the double moons to the room over the drying sheds, and lay down on his cot in the green, honest smell of cut reed. But he did not sleep. Elian did not sleep that night. He lay on his cot in the reed-smelling dark, and turned the old man's arithmetic over and over, and he thought about the road that went north out of the valley toward nothing, and how easy it would be to take it, and how it would keep him whole and free, and utterly alone the way he had been his whole life, and how the thought of it now made him feel not free but sick. He thought about a small, solemn creature who lay awake in fear of his leaving. He thought about a tired woman's real laugh, startled out of her against her will, and the flash of something like fear in her eyes at the discovery that she was allowed to feel it. He thought about a broker with a soft voice who came at the turn of the season to choose a person to take. By the gray hour before the suns, he had made his third free choice, and it was the largest of them all, and it settled into him not as a fever but as a great and unexpected calm. He was not going to take the northern road. He was going to stay, and he was going to stand between these people and the thing that was coming for them, and he did not fully understand yet what that would cost, but he understood that the not staying would cost more, and would cost it to a child, and that was a price he found he was simply unwilling to let anyone pay. He said none of this aloud. He was not a man of speeches. Instead, in the days that followed, he did what he had always done, which was to work and to watch, and to prepare quietly for a storm he could see building along the flats of his own future. He learned everything he could about Vex Corving. He learned it from Toma, and from the market folk who had watched the broker come and go for 3 years, and from the shape of the fear he left behind him. Corvin traveled with 4 hired men, hard cases out of the ring stations with old military gear and no love of anyone, and he traveled in a long, low ground crawler that could cross the pan, and he did not, as a rule, use violence because he did not have to. His weapon was the paper. His weapon was the law, or the frayed frontier remnant of it, the fact that a debt was a debt, and the coalition's distant magistrates, if they were ever roused to look at all, would look at the ledger and not at the widow. Corvin took his coin, and when there was not enough coin, he took a person, legally, indenting them against the count under a labor clause that the ring stations honored, and there was nothing anyone could do about it, because the alternative was to raise a hand against a lawful creditor and be branded outlaw across the whole reach, with a bounty that would draw worse men than Corvin down on the valley. That was the trap of it. That was why the valley had endured, season after season, and paid and shrunk and mourned. To fight Corvin openly was to become the very thing the law would then destroy you for. And Elian, turning it over in the long work hours, understood that a man could not simply meet this broker with his fists, however much the broker deserved it, without dooming the very people he meant to protect. So he studied the enemy the way he studied a leaking seam or a bent axle patiently, from every side, looking for the flaw in the seal. He questioned the market folk about the exact words Corvin used when he raised the figure, because the exact words of a careful man are where his weakness hides. He asked Toma to bring out the valley's old debt tokens, the brittle consortium chits that the borrowing had been recorded on 3 winters back, and he sat up whole nights over them by lamplight, reading the tiny archaic script that no one in the valley had bothered to read because they had all assumed, as Corvin counted on them assuming, that the paper meant only what the broker said it meant. He did not find his answer in the valley. But he found the edge of it, a single phrase in the fine print of the old consortium charter, referenced but not written out, a clause named only by its old number, and the number meant nothing to anyone in Anduvesh. It would mean something, he suspected, at the ring station registry, where the full charter was kept. That was why, one gray morning, he told the town he was going to trade for pitch, and instead made the long, cold journey coreward to the grimy steel wheel, where the debt brokers kept their offices, and spent the last of his freighter back pay on a scribe's hour in the registry archive, and came back 3 days later with a data slate and a look on his face that Toma, meeting him on the road, could not read. "I have found something," was all Elian said. "It may be enough, it may be nothing. Say nothing to Sella, I don't want to give her a hope I can't keep." But it was not the plan in the end that mattered most in those weeks. It was the thing that grew between the human and the house of Sella while the plan quietly took shape. Because the closer the turn of the season came, the more the 3 of them drew together, as if some part of them all knew that the coming storm would either break them apart forever or bind them for good. Sella had stopped watching him for the hook. Somewhere in the season of small mended things, she had let it go, and what came after the wariness was something she seemed almost afraid of, a quiet ease in his presence, a habit of turning to tell him things before she remembered there was no reason he should care, and the small daily astonishment that he cared anyway. She began to save the good tea for the evenings he sat by the loom. She began to weave a little slower, and stop a little sooner, and sleep a little more, because there was, for the first time in 3 winters, a second pair of hands in the world that would catch what fell if she rested. She did not name any of this. Neither did he. But the town saw it, the way the town saw everything, and the market folk began to speak of the human and the weaver in the particular soft tone that a small place reserves for a thing it is quietly rooting for. And Nyari bloomed. That was the only word for it. The child who had recited her family's grief to a stranger on a storm night, flat-voiced and too old, became, over the season, a child again. She laughed the loud, startled laughs of the very young. She invented games and dragooned the human into playing them. She taught him the Thessa names for the stars, sitting on his shoulders on the flat roof of the loom shed in the cool evenings, her small hands over his eyes and then off again to reveal the sky. And she named each light for him in the old tongue, and made him repeat it until he had it right, and scolded him when he did not. She began, without asking anyone's permission, to call him a word in the Thessa tongue that he did not at first understand. And when he asked Toma what it meant, the old man was quiet a moment, and then said, gruffly, that it was the word a Thessa child used for the one who stands at the door, the keeper of the household's threshold, which had once meant the father and now, in these thinned-out days, meant only whoever it was that a child trusted to keep the dark outside from coming in. The star lessons became their evening ritual, and it was on the roof of the loom shed, with the child perched on his shoulders and the whole cold glory of the rim sky wheeling overhead, that Elian came closest to understanding what had happened to him. Nyari knew the Thessa names for every light, taught to her by her mother, who had them from her own mother, a chain of naming that reached back further than the debt or the mine or the consortium, back to the first Thessa who had ever looked up from this valley and decided the darkness needed friendly names. There was the Watcher, and the 2 sisters, and the long dim smear the Thessa called the Road of the Dead that a soul walked to join the ancestors, and the small fierce blue point low in the north that Nyari informed him, with great authority, was the star that humans came from, though it was not, and Elian never told her so, because she said it with such pride, as if his coming from a star made him more wonderful and not less. and he had spent his whole life wishing someone would find him wonderful, and could not bring himself to spoil it. "When I am grown," the child announced one evening, apropos of nothing in the way of children, "I will name a star for you, a new one that does not have a name yet. And it will be the brightest, and everyone in the valley will learn it, and long after we are all walking the road of the dead, the children will still say your name when they look up, and they will not even know why, only that it is a good name for a bright thing." She said it as a simple statement of the future, a thing already decided. And Elian, sitting under the whole indifferent dark with a small warm weight on his shoulders promising to hang his name among the stars, had to be quiet for a while before he could trust his voice. Elian did not correct her, not about the star and not about the word she called him. He could not have said why. He only knew that when the small voice called him the keeper of the threshold, something in him that had been cold his whole life turned toward it like a plant toward light. And he understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that he would burn the world down before he let anything take these two away. It was Nyari, in the end, who said aloud the thing that the adults were all too careful or too frightened to say. It happened on an ordinary evening, a handful of days before the turn of the season, with the plan still folded and secret in Elian's kit, and the shadow of Corvin's coming already cooling the whole valley. The three of them were on the roof of the loom shed after the meal, in the blue hour, and Sella was pointing out to her daughter the first star of the evening, the one the Thessa called the Watcher, and Nyari, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly sat up very straight with the whole force of a decided child, and turned to Elian, and folded her small hands the way she had that first day in the square when she had crossed to ask if he was a thief. "Elian," she said, in the grave, deliberate voice of someone spending everything she has on being brave, "I have to ask you a thing, a big thing. And you have to answer it truly because it is the most important thing, and I have thought about it for a long time, and I decided that I am the one who has to ask, because a mother cannot ask it for herself, and a child can ask anything." She took a breath that shook only a little. "Will you marry my mother, and be the keeper of our threshold, not just the word but the real thing, so that when the man Corvin comes to take her, you can stand in the door and say she is of your house, and he cannot? And so that she is not alone any more, ever. And so that you do not go on the road toward nothing, because I know that is where you were going. I heard the old man say it, and I do not want you to go there. I want you to stay here with us and be ours. Not to keep. You are a person. But to choose, the way you choose to fix a thing, will you choose us?" The blue hour went utterly silent. On the roof, Sella had gone rigid, her hand still half raised toward the Watcher star, her breath stopped in her throat, and the color of pure mortified terror rising up her clay-dark face, because her 7-year-old daughter had just laid the family's whole naked heart out on the roof stones in front of the one person in the galaxy she had not dared to hope for, and had not let herself want. She began to speak, to snatch it back, to apologize, to save them both from the ruin of the moment. But Elian raised his hand gently, and she stopped. He was looking at the child, and there were tears standing in his human eyes, the strange bright water of his kind, and he was not ashamed of them, and he did not wipe them away. He looked at the small, solemn creature who had crossed a square to ask a stranger if he was a thief, and had fed him in a storm, and had lain awake in fear of his leaving, and had now spent every scrap of her small, brave heart to ask him the largest question a person can ask, on behalf of a mother who could not ask it for herself. And what Elian Marsh said next would be carried out of that valley, and off that forgotten amber moon, and up through the ring stations and along the frayed trade lanes and into the great ringed capitals of the coalition, until it reached worlds that had never heard the name Seshdalan and never would have, except for this. It would be repeated in 100 tongues. It would be argued over by scholars of the humankind, who thought they had already catalogued everything strange and fierce about the species from the crowded blue-green world. It would make, in the end, quite literally, a great swath of the talking galaxy fall silent. But that came after. In the moment, on the roof, in the blue hour, there was only a young man and a child and a woman with her breath stopped in her throat, and the first star of the evening looking down. Elian knelt on the roof stones, so that his eyes were level with the child's, because some things must be said eye to eye or not at all. "Nyari of the house of Sela," he said, and his voice was rough with the water standing in his eyes, "I'm going to answer you truly, because you asked truly, and you're right that a child can ask anything and deserves a true answer back." He drew a breath. "Where I come from, marriage isn't a thing you do to stand in a doorway and stop a bad man, though I understand why you asked it that way, and I love you for asking it that way, because it means you were trying to protect your mother, and that's the bravest thing a person can do. But your mother is a person, the same as me, the same as you. And a person doesn't get married to be saved. A person gets married to be chosen, and to choose back freely, both of them with their eyes open. So I can't answer your question, little one. It isn't mine to answer. It's hers." And he turned, still kneeling, to Sela, who sat frozen with the last light of the blue hour caught in her lantern eyes. And he did the thing that was harder than facing any broker, harder than any storm off the pan, the thing he had been unable to look at directly for a whole season. "I came here with nothing," he said to her quietly, as if the child and the star and the whole valley had fallen away, and there were only the two of them on the roof of the world. No home, no people, no one in the galaxy who'd have noticed if I'd walked off the edge of the northern road and never come back. I told myself that was freedom. I told myself for years. And then a small person crossed a square and asked me if I was a thief and gave me water and fed me in a storm, and I found out that I'd never been free, I'd only been alone, and I hadn't known there was a difference until I stopped being it. His hand found the roof stone between them, not touching her, only near. I don't want the northern road. I stopped wanting it a long time ago and was too much a coward to say so. What I want is this. This roof, this valley, that star you were naming, the sound of your loom in the evening, that child. You, if you'll have me, not to save you. You've saved yourself and her every single day for 3 winters, and you never needed a man in the door to do it. But because I would rather choose you and be chosen than be free and alone for the rest of my life. That's my answer. The rest of it is yours." For a long moment Sela could not speak at all. 3 winters of holding herself apart, of expecting the hook in every gift, of weaving all night so she could pretend she had slept, of grief worn each morning like a coat, all of it stood between her and the words, a wall she had built stone by stone to keep from breaking. And then her daughter reached over and put one small hand into the human's near hand on the roof stone, and looked at her mother with enormous shining eyes, and the wall came down. "Yes," Sela said, and the word broke out of her like the first laugh had, startled and true and terrifying and free. "Yes, I choose. I have been choosing for half a season and telling myself I was not. The strange bright water of grief and joy, which is much the same water, ran down her clay-dark face. Yes, keeper of our threshold, stay, be ours, be chosen." And on the roof of the loom shed, in the last blue light, with the watcher star looking down, the 3 of them held on to one another as if to keep from falling off the edge of the turning world. And for that one evening, the shadow along the flats was forgotten. The joining came 3 nights later, and the whole of Andu Vesh made it theirs. Among the Thessa there was no distant office to record a marriage and no paper to stamp. There was only the old way, which was witness and word and cord, and which was, Elian came to understand, a far weightier thing than any registry, because it bound not 2 people but 2 people and the whole community that stood to see it done. When word went round the market that the human and the weaver were to be joined, the poor valley did a thing that poor places do better than rich ones ever manage. It emptied its meager store to make a feast, and no one counted the cost, because the counting of cost was Corvin's disease, and the valley wanted this one night to be free of it. The widow of the mended door brought her last jar of preserved sweetroot. The market folk brought lamps of rendered fat, dozens of them, and strung them along the square until the packed red earth glowed amber deep into the night. Someone unearthed a drum, and someone else a set of reed pipes, and the old songs came out, the ones the Thessa sang at the joinings that had grown too few in the thinned-out years, and for the first time in 3 winters the valley remembered how to be glad. Elian stood in the square in a clean tunic that Sela had woven for him in secret, dyed the deep blue of the Watcher Star, and he had never in his life felt so seen, and so unafraid of being seen. Toma Veshalden stood as witness of standing, straight-backed on his staff, and he spoke the old words in the old tongue, and then again in the trade Creole so that the human would understand the vows he was making. And Elian made them, every one in a voice that did not shake, though the water stood bright in his eyes. He vowed to stand at the threshold. He vowed to face the dark first, so that those within need not face it at all. He vowed that the house of Sela and the house of Marsh were now one house, and that its debts were his debts, and its griefs his griefs, and its children his children, to the end of his days. And then came the part that the valley would tell of longest, because it was Nyari who did it. Among the Thessa, the marriage cord, a braided length of the finest reed thread, was tied about the joined wrists of the couple by a child of the household, if the household had one, because a child was the future the joining was meant to protect, and it was held that no hands were purer to bind a promise than the hands of the one who would inherit it. So Nyari, in a new shift the color of the first star, her lantern eyes enormous with the gravity of her office, took the cord her mother had woven and wound it 3 times about the 2 joined wrists, and tied the knot the way Toma had spent a whole afternoon teaching her, her small tongue caught between her teeth in concentration, and when the knot held she looked up at both of them and said, in a fierce small whisper that carried further than she knew, "Now you cannot come untied. I made sure. I made it very tight." The whole square laughed and wept and laughed again, and the drum began, and the lamps burned, and they danced the slow circling dances of the Thessa until the twin moons of Seshtalun were high, and Elian Marsh, who had grown up among a great press of people, and had never once belonged to any of them, danced in the middle of a whole valley that had chosen him back, with a woman's hand in one of his and a child riding on his shoulders in the other, and understood that this, precisely this, was the thing the northern road could never have given him, not in 1,000 years of walking. But the shadow did not forget them. The turn of the season came, and with it, 4 days later, a plume of ochre dust on the northern road that was not a storm. The whole of Anduvesh saw it and went quiet, the market emptying, doors closing, mothers gathering children in. The long, low ground crawler of Vex Corvin came grinding down into the valley with its 4 hard men riding the rails, and it stopped in the square, in the same spot where a young human had once knelt to drink from the well, and the broker stepped down. He was a lean, gray-skinned being of a species Elian did not know, dressed in the soft, expensive fabrics of the ring stations, and everything about him was soft. His voice, his hands, his movements, the softness of a man who has never once in his life had to do a hard thing himself because the law and his hired men did it for him. He carried a data slate the way another man might carry a blade. He looked around the emptied square with the mild patience of a creditor, who has done this many times and knows the ending. "Anduvesh," Corvin said pleasantly to the closed doors. "You know why I've come. Bring me your headman and your ledger payment and let us be civilized as we always are. I've no wish to make the day unpleasant, but the season's figure is due, and I'm told, sadly, that the valley's short again. So, let us discuss the other coin." Toma Veshalden came out of the shrine with his staff, old and straight-backed, and behind him came the folk of the valley, drawn out one by one from their closed doors, because they would not let their headman stand alone, and they gathered at the edges of the square, a silent crowd of clay-dark faces and lantern eyes. And Corvin's 4 men shifted, and let their hands rest near their old military gear, not drawing, only reminding. "The valley cannot make the figure," Toma said without preamble. "You know it cannot. You have said it so it cannot on purpose these 3 years because you do not want coin. You want a person to sell. So say the name you have already chosen, broker, and let us have done with the pretense." Corvin's soft face registered a mild, unbothered regret. He consulted the data slate as if he did not already know. "The largest single account in the valley," he said, "belongs to the House of Sela, the Weaver. A widow, I understand, which is unfortunate, but the labor clause is quite clear, and her particular skill would work the count off in, some years. Fewer if she's diligent." He looked up, mild as milk. "Bring her out. She may bring one bag. The child stays. The ring stations are no place for the very young. I'm not a monster. There will be arrangements for the child, some orphan house, quite adequate. Bring out the Weaver, and the rest of your debts I'll carry another season out of the goodness of." "No," said Elian Marsh, and stepped out of the crowd into the open square. Corvin's 4 men tensed all at once, and their hands closed on their gear, and for a heartbeat the whole square balanced on a blade's edge. But Elian's own hands were open and empty, and held out from his sides, and he walked into the center of the square slow and unarmed, and stopped a few paces from the broker. And it was the very fact that he carried no weapon that made the 4 men hesitate, because they had come ready for a fight and did not know what to do with a man who plainly did not intend to give them one. "You're the human," Corvin said, and for the first time a flicker of something crossed his soft face, not fear exactly, but the wariness of a careful man encountering a variable he had not accounted for. "I heard there was a human out here, playing at being a local. This is no business of yours, Offworlder. Human law, coalition law, none of it reaches this far, and the debt is lawful. And if you raise a hand to a creditor, you'll have every bounty man in the reach down on this valley, and their blood will be on you. So be a wise young man and step aside, and go back to whatever road you wandered in from." "I'm not going to raise a hand to you," Elian said. His voice carried across the silent square, clear and level, and there was in it none of the heat of a man about to fight and all of the certainty of a man who has already won and is only now explaining why. "You're right about the law. I looked into it. I spent the last coin I had going up to your ring station to look into it, because I figured a man like you only ever loses to the law, never to fists, and I wanted to beat you the way that would stick." He reached into his coat slowly, so the 4 men could see, and drew out the data slate he had carried back from the station and told no one about, and held it up. "So here's the thing I found, broker. The labor clause you sell people under. It's lawful, sure, but it isn't the only lawful thing. There's an older clause from the consortium's own charter that your bought-up debt still runs under, whether you like it or not. The clause of household relief. It says that a debt against a household passes to the household, all of it shared, and that any lawful member of that household may assume the whole of it in a single instrument and discharge it by labor or by coin over a fixed term, at fixed interest, with no clause of taking, no indenture, no separation of a parent from a child. It was written to stop exactly what you do. The consortium buried it, and you brokers have counted on nobody out here ever reading the old charter." He lowered the slate and his eyes did not leave Corvin's. "I read it." Corvin's soft voice had gone very quiet. "You're not a member of the household of Sela," he said. "You're a wandering offworlder with a mule. That clause is nothing to you." And this was the moment. This was the moment that would ripple out of the valley and up through the ring stations, and along the frayed trade lanes to the great ringed capitals. The moment 1,000 tongues would repeat and scholars would argue over, because of what the young human did, and said next in the emptied square of a moon that no one important had ever bothered to remember. Elian turned and held out his hand, and from the edge of the silent crowd Sela came to him, and Nyari came with her, the child's hand fast in her mother's, and the 3 of them stood together in the center of the square, in front of the whole of Ondu Vesh and the gray broker and his 4 hard men. And Toma Veshaldan, understanding at last, came forward too with his staff, because the assuming of a household under the old charter required a witness of standing, and there was no elder in the valley of higher standing than he. 3 nights before you came, before this whole town, I was joined to the house of Sela, Elian said, and it was true, for the joining among the Thessa was a thing of witness and word and not of distant paper, and Toma had stood witness, and the valley had feasted as best a poor valley could, and the child had been given the honor of tying the marriage cord because it was she who had asked the question that made it. I am a lawful member of this household. Ask the elder. Ask any soul in this square. And under the clause of household relief, which your own bought debt still runs under, I assume the whole of the debt of the house of Sela, here, now, in a single instrument, to be discharged by my labor and my coin over the fixed term the charter allows. He held the slate out steady. It's already lodged with the magistrate's registry at the station. I filed it before I came back. All it needs is your mark of receipt, which the charter compels you to give, or you stand in unlawful refusal of a lawful relief, and it's your license the magistrate strips, not this valley's peace. So take the coin over the honest term, broker, because the person is not for sale, not her, not any of them. Not ever in this valley again. The soft man looked at the slate, and at the elder's grave nod of confirmation, and at the four hard men who had come for an easy taking and now faced only law they could not bend, and the whole soft edifice of him understood in a moment that he had lost, cleanly, finally, in the one arena he had thought forever his. His face did not so much fall as go still, the stillness of a ledger closing. He tried once, the only card left to a man like him, to name a figure so cruel that even the honest term would break the household. But Elian had done the reckoning too, over those same lamplit nights, and named it back to the copper, and showed how a house with 2 pairs of hands and a valley lending theirs would pay it and still eat. And there was nothing the broker could say to that, because it was arithmetic, and arithmetic had always been his own weapon, and now it was turned in his hand. He made the mark. He had to, and a debt that had bred like a plague for 3 winters became, in an instant, a plain and honest thing that a household could pay. But it was not the law, in the end, that made the galaxy fall silent. Corvin's 4 men had come from the ring stations, and the ring stations kept records, and the crawler's own hull recorder had caught all of it, sound and image, the way such devices always are running, and one of the 4, a hard case with nothing left to lose and a grudge against his soft-handed employer, sold the recording that same season to a station broadsheet for the price of a berth off the Reach. And so the thing spread. It went up the frayed lanes, and along the relays from station to station, the strange footage of the unarmed young human standing in a dust square on a forgotten moon, and it might have died there as a small curiosity, except for the last of what he said, which the broadsheets clipped and repeated and could not stop repeating, because no one who heard it could quite let it go. For before he stepped back, Elian had turned, not to the broker, but to the child, who stood clutching her mother's hand, and he had knelt again to be level with her lantern eyes, in front of the recorder and the crowd and the whole indifferent dark, and he had said the thing that would be carried to worlds that had never heard of Sesh'D'Lun. "You asked me once if I was a thief," he said to Nyari gently, and the square was so still that the recorder caught every word. "And I told you that where I come from, if the water lets you drink, you're a guest. But you taught me the rest of it. You taught me that a guest can choose to become something more if he's brave enough, and that the bravest thing a person ever does isn't to fight, it's to belong. My people came up out of a hard world, little one. We were small and soft and slow, and the dark was full of things bigger than us with more teeth than us, and we should never have survived it. Do you know how we did? Not with claws, not with size. We survived because when one of us was cold, the others made a place by the fire. Because we decided a long time ago on a world you'll never see that no one of ours faces the dark alone. That's the whole of it. That's the only weapon we ever really had. We are the people who stand in the door. And once a human chooses you, once we say you are ours, there is no debt long enough, no law crooked enough, and no dark wide enough in all the turning galaxy to take you from us. That's not a threat, and it's not a boast. It's just what we are. You are mine, and your mother is mine, and this valley is mine, and I would cross the whole of the dark on foot before I'd let anyone take one of you into it alone. You never have to ask me again. The answer was always going to be yes. And that was the thing the galaxy could not let go of. Because the wider coalition thought it knew the humankind, it had filed them under fierce, under stubborn, under dangerous when cornered, the frightening clever soft-bodied things from the blue-green world who fought too long and gave up too rarely. That was the human in the galaxy's ledger. And then out of a forgotten dust moon came this footage of an unarmed boy kneeling in the dirt to promise a small alien child that she would never again face the dark alone, and calling it not love, not sacrifice, but simply what we are, as if belonging to the vulnerable were the most ordinary fact of his species in the universe. And the ledger was wrong, and everyone who watched it knew at once and altogether that the ledger had always been wrong. They had thought the humans were dangerous because they fought. They had never understood that the humans were dangerous because of what they fought for. On a station in the Vharun Reach, a dock master who had refused a berth to more human crews than he could count watched the footage on a public relay 3 times, and then went quietly to his ledger and struck a debt he had been holding over a stranded family, and could not have told anyone why, except that a boy on a dust moon had made him ashamed of a coldness he had never before thought to question. In a trade hall in one of the great ringed capitals, a delegate from a species that measured all worth in coin watched the recording in the middle of a negotiation and forgot, for a full minute, what he had been about to say, and when he found his voice again, the thing he negotiated for was not the thing he had come for. A schoolmistress on a distant colony played it for her class of a dozen small alien children and had no words to explain it and did not try, and simply let them watch a human kneel in the dust. And one of the children afterward asked if humans would come to their colony too, and would one of them stay, and the schoolmistress found she did not know how to answer a hope that large. The footage went everywhere. It was translated, mistranslated, argued, parodied, and revered, and through all of it the one line held, clear as a struck bell across 100 tongues: "We are the people who stand in the door." There were scholars of the humankind, in the deep archives of the Coalition, who had spent whole careers cataloging the species, and who had written long treatises on human aggression, human tenacity, the frightening human refusal to accept a lost cause. They watched the footage from Seshdalan, and one by one they understood that they had spent their careers studying the wrong thing entirely. They had measured the claw and missed the reason the claw was ever bared. The humans did not fight because they loved fighting. The humans fought because somewhere in their long climb up out of a hard world they had made a single decision and never once unmade it, that the vulnerable would not be left alone in the dark, and everything else about them, all the tenacity and the terror and the refusal to yield, was only the shape that one decision took when something came for the ones they had chosen. The treatises were rewritten. The ledger entry was corrected. And where the galaxy's file on humanity had once read dangerous when cornered, someone, in the quiet after the silence, added a single line beneath it. And there is no cornering them at all, for they will call the whole dark down on themselves before they will let it have a child. In the great ringed capitals, in the trade halls and the relay stations and the crowded ports where 100 species crossed and never touched, the recording played and the talk stopped. Beings who had never in their long histories imagined that a stranger might kneel in the dust and make himself a father, a keeper of a threshold not his own, out of nothing but choice, watched a young human do exactly that, and could find, for a long moment, nothing at all to say. It was not a silence of horror. It was the silence of a great many people discovering, all at once, a thing they had been missing their whole lives and had not known the name of. It moved outward like a ring in still water, from the reach to the lanes to the capitals, world after world going quiet as the footage reached it, until it seemed, for one strange turning of the day, as if a whole talking galaxy had drawn a single breath and held it. The galaxy fell silent, and in the silence, on a small amber moon that no one important had ever bothered to remember, it was evening. The broker was long gone. north up the road toward wherever soft men go when their softness fails them. And he did not come back, not to Anduvesh, not ever, because the magistrate's office, roused at last by a filing it could not ignore and a recording it could not unsee, had questions for him about a great many valleys and a clause he had spent 3 years pretending not to know. The debt of the House of Sela was an honest term now, and the honest term was already shrinking, because a household with 2 pairs of hands and a whole grateful valley lending theirs is a strong thing, and Elian Marsh had never in his life been afraid of work. On the flat roof of the loom shed in the blue hour, the 3 of them sat as they had sat before, and Sela pointed out the first star of the evening, the Watcher, and named it in the old tongue, and Nyari corrected her human's pronunciation and scolded him, and he got it wrong again on purpose to hear her laugh. The loom stood quiet in the shed below. There would be weaving tomorrow and roof pitch to render, and 100 small mended things, and a life, an ordinary life, which was the most extraordinary thing that any of the 3 of them had ever dared to hope for. Nyari leaned her small head against the human's arm, and her lantern eyes grew heavy, and just before sleep took her, she murmured the question she no longer needed to ask, only to hear the answer, the way a child asks for the same story every night. You will not go on the road toward nothing. And Elian Marsh, keeper of the threshold, who had come to a forgotten moon with a stone in his boot and no soul in the galaxy to notice, and had found there the only thing he had ever truly wanted, drew the child closer against the coming dark, and looked up at the Watcher star, and gave her the answer that a whole galaxy had fallen silent to hear. "No," he said, "I'm already home." The answer was always going to be yes.